You healed from what they pretended not to break. You whispered love. They shouted distance. You asked for honesty. They gave you silence. They ignored the version of you that only loved them. You stayed soft in a world that hardened them. You gave access. They gave excuses. They weren't confused, just calculating. You begged for effort. They offered alibis. They watched you drown in doubt they created. You asked, "Are we okay?" They answered with distance. They got bored of what they never explored. You showed love. They performed it. They couldn't hold you, so they broke you. You were deep. They stayed shallow. You didn't fall too fast. They never stood still. They gave you pieces. You gave them peace. You offered roots. They wanted wings. You asked for presence. They offered potential. They called your clarity crazy. You offered your soul. They needed space. You made them your home. They stayed a stranger. They drained you and blamed your emptiness. They held grudges. You held your breath. You begged for connection. They begged for time. They mistook routine for romance. You asked, "Are we growing?" They laughed. They knew how to stay, but chose to leave. You outgrew their avoidance. They showed you every red flag and called it love. You were trying. They were trying to leave. They saw your heart and still chose games. You weren't clingy. You were confused. They ran before the truth could catch them. You loved with no escape plan. They loved the version of you that didn't ask for more. You cried in their silence. They needed validation. You needed vision. You were real. They were rehearsed. You made love sacred. They made it strategic. They tested your limits. You honored theirs. You stopped asking. They thought you stopped caring. You thought it was timing. It was avoidance. They left you on red. The universe rewrote your story. You offered your heart. They offered your heartache. They saw your love as a lesson, not a lifetime. You weren't hard to understand, just hard to misuse. They feared your honesty. You held it together. They held back. They didn't ghost you. They revealed themselves. You looked at them and saw purpose. They looked at you and saw pressure. They gave you hope, then hid from it. You weren't too much. They were too numb. They loved your glow, but couldn't handle the fire. You asked, "What are we?" They asked, "Why label it?" They watched you fold into someone you're not. You were loyal in their absence. You didn't need them to fix it, just feel it. They played detached. You played devoted. You didn't walk away. You woke up. You begged them to care. They called it drama. They dismissed your softness, then chased chaos. You were healing. They were hiding. They turned your vulnerability into leverage. You made space. They filled it with distance. They liked attention. You needed intention. You offered stillness. They feared silence. They thought you'd stay broken. You chose rebirth. You stayed real. They stayed afraid. You were clear. They were clever. They said forever with fingers crossed. You apologized for being aware. They didn't fall out of love. They fell out of hiding. You weren't asking for love. You were asking for truth. They ignored your presence. The universe noticed your worth. You stayed up nights for someone who slept peacefully. They were waiting for your light to dim. You spoke your truth. They changed the subject. They gave you illusions. You gave them chances you were never hard to hold. Just too bright to dim. They took the easy way out. You took the honest way through. You lost sleep for someone who lost interest. They loved your potential, not your pain. You tried to understand their chaos. They misunderstood your calm. You weren't silent. They were selective listeners. They left because you were too real. You fought for us. They fought for freedom. They blamed timing. You blamed yourself. They offered love with an exit plan. You watered roots. They chased wings. They chose escape over evolution. You made them feel seen. They made you feel small. They mistook your soul for strategy. You were magic. They were manipulation. You were patient. They were pretending. They loved you like a secret. You gave them peace. They gave you pauses. They broke promises. You broke patterns. You believed in signs. They ignored signals. They played distant. You played honest. You hoped they'd stay. They hoped you'd stop asking. You forgave before they finished hurting. They were silent when your heart was loud. You trusted timing. They tested it. They feared depth. You drowned in it. You miss them in silence they'll never hear. They think you're okay. You trained them too well. The love still lingers, but so does the damage. You held on. They just held back. You're healing from someone who won't even admit they hurt you. Give. Some souls confuse chaos for connection. You loved loudly. They loved when it was convenient. The universe whispered, you deserved more, but you settled. They touched your body. You wanted them to touch your soul. You begged in silence. They heard nothing. You forgave what they never apologized for. You saw forever. They saw a phase. You were their peace. They were your storm. They gave you breadcrumbs. You built a feast. You're not hard to love. They were unready. You're not cold. just done being burned. You watched them choose comfort over connection. They knew how to hurt you, and still did. You wanted depth. They wanted distraction. You loved their potential, not their truth. You were the mirror. They broke it. They left, thinking you'd never stop waiting. They were a lesson disguised as a soulmate. You were loyal to their mask, not their soul. Love didn't leave. They did. You remembered the moments. They forgot the meaning. You kept showing up. They kept disappearing. You wanted growth. They wanted control. They ran from love, then blamed you for the distance. They acted like you were replaceable. Now they chase shadows. Your silence is louder than your pain ever was. You wanted truth. They gave you games. They thought you'd never notice the shift. You did. You begged for clarity. They thrived in confusion. You outgrew the version of love they offered. You're not broken. You're becoming. You weren't asking for too much, just from the wrong heart. You were a lighthouse. They chose the storm. They lost you slowly, then all at once. You remembered every word. They remembered every excuse. They never met your soul, only your fears. You were honest. They were convenient. They feared being seen, so they ghosted your light. They didn't want you to move on, just to wait. You became the closure you never received. They felt your worth only after you left. You healed in silence. They stayed noisy in denial. They didn't break your heart. They revealed it. You were a poem. They read you like a headline. You chose to stay. They chose to stray. You saw forever. They blinked. They were temporary. You were timeless. You tried to build. They tried to escape. They touched you, but never held you. You felt everything. They felt nothing deeply. You weren't hard to love. They were hard to reach. You sacrificed. They spectated. They thought silence would erase your pain. They watched your heart break and still asked for more. You didn't lose them. You found yourself. They left holes where promises once lived. They ran from your love, now chase imitations. They wanted control, not commitment. You saw beauty in their broken. They saw burden in your whole. They spoke in maybes. You lived in truths. You were the calm. They needed chaos. You gave love. They gave conditions. You believed them, even when their actions screamed otherwise. They weren't confused, just comfortable. You asked for love. They offered illusion. They didn't love you wrong. They didn't love you at all. You kept giving. They kept guessing. You deserved depth. They feared drowning. You weren't hard to understand. They lacked intention. They treated you like an option. Now you're unavailable. They chose pride over peace. You were full of love. They were full of fear. You gave your soul. They gave conditions. They loved your light, but couldn't stand your shadow. You watered a desert. You bled for their silence. You loved deeply. They loved safely. They mocked what they couldn't mirror. You showed up. They showed patterns. They craved control. You craved connection. They taught you how to live without them. You prayed for a sign. They sent silence. You gave magic. They wanted tricks. They left before learning how to stay. You trusted the timing. They played with it. You felt them slipping long before they let go. They mistook your softness for surrender. You were patient. They were passive. They confused chaos for chemistry. You asked the universe, why them? The universe replied, so you'd find you. You stopped begging. That's when they noticed. You weren't too much. They were too little. They wanted attention. You wanted a home. You offered peace. They needed punishment. They delayed love until it expired. You stayed. They strayed. You became the closure. You looked for answers. They hid the truth. They disappeared. You discovered yourself.